going to start out the review here by answering a few questions that you might have just from looking at the title of the video, especially if you're watching it from the United States. Let's see. Okay, yes, this is a real game, and believe it or not, as I didn't originally, it actually got released not just in Europe, but also in North America, with a simultaneous release of the game for the Genesis and Mega Drive hitting in December of 1994. You know, just in time for all those young North American rugby fans to ask for the game for Christmas. I can just imagine the poor people working at Electronics Boutique now that year desperately trying to tell the parents, no, I assure you, your kid does not want this game for Christmas. Please just buy them FIFA. Another answer for a question that you might have, while yes, technically this is the only rugby game to be released for the Genesis North America, it is not the only rugby game on the platform, as there's also International Rugby from Denmark, and then the direct follow-up to Rugby World Cup 95, Australian Rugby League, both of which I'll get to eventually. But in the case of International Rugby, that's one that I've still got to import a copy of because there's clearly something terribly wrong with me. And for the final question that you might have, no, I know nothing about rugby because I'm an American. Well, that's not entirely true. I mean, I've seen the odd highlights here and there over the years, people running about with no pads except the odd leather football helmet from the 1930s, while carrying a ball that seems oddly shaped. And then seemingly random stoppages for drop-kicking a ball through what looks like a goalpost, but not quite. Oh, and also a scoring system that I can't make any sense out of whatsoever. I'm fairly sure that Bill Watterson of Calvin and Hobbes fame randomly saw a rugby match at 2 a.m. while trying to meet a comic strip deadline and came up with the idea of Calvin Ball based on rugby's scoring. However, I should probably pause for a second because I'm sure that there's some of you out there that don't know me and are either nodding in agreement with everything that I just said, or are screaming at your monitor that I'm an idiot, or both. Hi, my name is Dave, and welcome to Zilog and Moto, the channel where I'm going to try really hard not to piss off any actual rugby players in this review, because those dudes are scary. Anyway, I'm out to collect and review the nearly 1,280 titles released in the English language for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD as the case may be, and finally the 32X. Basically, if I can plug it into a Genesis, either by itself or with some sort of add-on, and be able to read what's up on the screen, I'm trying to get a copy of it and review it for posterity, with both looks at that original packaging and gameplay captured from original hardware whenever possible. So, Rugby World Cup 95. Suffice it to say, this week's review is going to be a huge learning experience for myself. I mean, a lot of these reviews are. That's kind of the point of doing them. If I knew everything about a game before sitting down to do the review, that'd be pretty boring. However, I do just want to put a warning label on this. I'm sure that there's probably going to be a lot of nuance here about the sport that I'm not going to be able to pick up in a week. So if I say something that's not quite right, or maybe I'm missing something that would be obvious to a normal fan, please feel free to correct me in the comments down below. But regardless, I'm going to give this one the good old college try, and maybe we'll see if EA was onto something with this release, or if there's a reason why Electronic Arts hasn't attempted to do more with this series over the years. But first, something that I don't usually do, a look at both the North American and European packages. And here's my copies of both the Genesis and Mega Drive releases of Rugby World Cup 95. Yes, for once, I actually have both versions of the game, and I'm not just going to be showing pictures of covers to compare the two. You might be wondering why I have two copies of the game, and based on the intro, I think you can clearly deduce it's not because I'm a big rugby fan. No, this one's a lot simpler. Years ago, when I first started collecting for the channel, I was doing a bulk order of a bunch of European games on eBay to try to save on shipping, and I saw this and assumed it was a PAL-only release, so I grabbed it. And then I'm pretty sure like a month later, I go into one of the local shops to see if anything new had popped up, and there was the American version sitting right there just calling me a moron to my face. The lesson is, as fun as it is to go buy something new, maybe at least know what you're buying before you make the purchase. Believe it or not, this is not the only time that this has happened to me. Last year, I picked up a copy of the European version of the Flintstones in Atlanta, thinking it was a region exclusive because I'd never seen the American version. And it turns out, no, it's not. It's just the Genesis version is very hard to find. Clearly, I need to heed my own advice. Anyway, if you decide you want your own copy, the game is pretty available with copies of both editions going for about $10, maybe more if it's in particularly nice condition. As far as conditions go, the Genesis one here is the better of the two, even including the warranty card, but there is an unfortunate gouge to the back. The Mega Drive version has clearly seen better days with some clear water damage to the inner cover, but it's not horrible. One other note, since I have them both here, it's always interesting to me that for the 16-bit era, they used different clamshells. Note how smooth the clamshell is for the European copy, and how the North American clamshell is more textured. As far as the front covers go, I think they're both fine. The Genesis version goes with a much more extreme sports-looking logo, I'm sure to attract attention from the kids, while the Mega Drive version goes with a much more basic logo that was clearly intended to match up with the actual event. If you're not aware, there is a World Cup for rugby, just as the same as there is for soccer, so the decision to make this game wasn't just EA being like, hey, let's try making a rugby game, and as you can see on the Mega Drive version, there was even a contest to win tickets to it, which makes me wonder if anyone actually won that contest or not. The logos being different makes sense, but I'm a little surprised that they went with different pictures of the athletes, with the Genesis version having a shot of what looks like Australia versus New Zealand, and then the Mega Drive going with Australia versus South Africa. Flipping over the back, I think both of these rear covers are interesting, but honestly, I think I prefer the simpler layout of the Mega Drive version, as that's just a lot of words on the Genesis version to hype it up, and they're kind of hard to read in places. Also, I find it interesting that the Mega Drive version simply tried to rely on a quote from Meme Machines to sell the game, whereas the Genesis version went with, "These guys think football players are sissies," just to show how different they felt like the marketing needed to be for each region. Opening both up, and we have the most important part of this game for an American, the manual, because I'm definitely going to have to read through here and study up on how on earth to play this game. The Mega Drive manual is notable for being one of the largest that I've seen, 140 pages covering 4 languages, and could probably stop a bullet if you needed to. Regardless of which version you have, the beginning of the manual attempts to explain some of the basics in terms of the game, and then the rest covers how to play the game itself in similar fashion to other EA Sports titles. They did a good job here, but I've got a feeling that I still might be watching an instructional video or two. Okay, that's the package. Let's get to the game and see what all this scrumming and mauling is about. So, I've got to be honest, when I started the process for reviewing this game, I was a little intimidated. I mean, I literally knew nothing about rugby other than it's sort of like a mix of American football and soccer. Or football and hand egg, or whatever catty name you use for American football instead. Also, I'd just love to see someone tell a rugby or Australian rules football player that their sport should be called hand egg, because I'm pretty sure an emergency trip to the dentist would be involved. Thankfully, we live in a world where YouTube is a thing, which is probably a silly thing to state seeing as how you're watching this video on YouTube. But anyway, I was able to find a video from a channel called Couch Rugby, where the gentleman who appeared to be a long-lost Hemsworth brother broke things down for me in about 15 minutes. What I got out of the video was that for my purposes, rugby is essentially a simplified version of American football, but with a playstyle more similar to soccer in that the action doesn't really stop outside of penalties, scoring, or out of bounds. This actually made things a lot simpler for me because, while I'm sure if you get into it, there's strategies involved for who is what position, i.e. who is the hooker versus who is the fullback, and how throw-ins are handled, how to actually play the game isn't nearly as involved as something like American football. And it's a sport where you could translate it to playing on a 3-button controller without a whole lot of nuance. And the manual does a good job of spelling out which buttons do what, with the offense boiling down to A, kick, B, lateral, and C, speed boost. And defense being A, diving tackle, B, change players, and C, again, speed boost. So now that I at least had some semblance of how the game is played, both in real life and on the console, the next step was actually booting up the game to attempt to play it. If you've played any EA Sports games from the era, you'll get a menu on boot up that looks probably somewhat familiar. Along with being able to choose from between English, French, or Italian from a language perspective, and no, I don't know why those are the three languages specifically they chose, you can also choose your game mode and then options related to gameplay. From a game mode perspective, I think they did a good job with the options presented, as you can either play a friendly match between any two teams, a custom World Cup, where you can pick any of the available teams in the game to compete, a World Cup mode specifically modeled after the 1995 Cup, meaning that you can only choose one of the 16 teams that qualified that year, or you can even create your own league, where rather than compete in a tournament, you play every other team in the league twice to eventually determine a champion by points, very similar to how certain major soccer leagues function. Given that the game is made up of national teams and that the players are somewhat generic, I'm not sure what else they could have added here, but it's worth noting that if you're expecting something like being able to create your own team or players, the game is simply not that deep. Along with the various game modes, Rugby World Cup also provides options for how the game should be played. There are options for half-length, weather, field conditions, and if you're playing in simulation or arcade mode. All pretty standard stuff when it comes to EA Sports titles. One thing that should be noted is, just like those other Electronic Arts games, there's no difficulty setting. So the only way that you can adjust difficulty of the game is to either pick a better team to play a worse team if you want an easier game, or vice versa if you want to make things harder for yourself. Other than not having a difficulty selector, and again, I'm not really surprised by that based on their other sports titles at the time, I'm not really sure what else someone might be expecting in terms of game options, especially with this being the first game of its kind. Although, I suppose there's always something else that you could have added. For my purposes, though, I think they did a solid job of covering the basics, and I like that you can customize some of these things for the tournaments, rather than just be forced to use whatever random weather options the Genesis thinks is appropriate in those other titles. With all that being said, I figured the best way to experience the game was to just jump in with a friendly and see what was really here, since I only very marginally knew what I was doing. I mean, it can be argued that I never know what I'm doing, but this is even a murkier situation than normal. And of course, I immediately ran into problems, but for once, it wasn't my fault. Now, I've run into this before on the channel, and I think specifically with other EA Sports 4-way play enabled games, but if you're using a Retrobit Genesis 6-button controller, the game will not work correctly, even if you put it into 3-button mode. A standard Genesis wired 6-button controller works fine, as does an 8-bit DOE M30 wireless pad, so just throwing it out there for anyone that tried to play this game in 2025 and beyond. I'm sure that someone that's more technically literate on Genesis peripherals can explain why this is, and if you're one of those, definitely leave a comment below explaining it, but the manual specifically mentions that the game is also not compatible with ASCII pads, so I'm assuming that it's the same problem for both. Once I figured out the controller situation, it was time to actually play that friendly, as England taking on Ireland. And I proceeded to get the crap kicked out of me. I didn't really have any idea what the hell was going on, and the action on screen seemed incredibly chaotic. Not unlike an actual rugby game. So that's one thing that I think it seems like they got right. After playing that first game, I was starting to somewhat get a feel of things, so I chose Australia versus Japan, and things started to click, possibly helped out by the fact that I was playing as a stronger team versus a weaker team. I'm not gonna lie, when I dove on the ground and scored that first try, it was pretty exciting. As I played more matches and started to understand a bit better about what was actually going on, I was able to really get used to the controls and be able to add in kicks, along with just lateraling and controlling the runner. Ultimately, the game is pretty simple from a control perspective, and I could see someone that doesn't know anything about rugby, like myself, being able to learn and be competitive against the computer with only a few hours of gameplay. But with that simplicity, there were also some things that stood out that seemed like made the game a little too unpredictable. At least coming from someone that was familiar with games like Madden, where you feel you're in control a majority of the time, with just the occasional bit of random chance. The first of those things is the sheer amount of fumbles that occur, and it's a lot. Granted, this could just be something that's simply different about rugby that I'm not familiar with, but at first it seemed like there was very little control over what happened when a player was hit, adding to the chaotic feel of the game. And again, this might just be something that goes along with EA trying to replicate the wild nature of the game, so I don't want to take off points for it, but when you first start playing the game, there's more than likely going to be a feeling of WTF, as far as what's going on. Along with the volatility of the possessions, there's how two set pieces in the game are handled, the scrum and the line-out. The scrum is probably the most famous part of rugby that even people that don't know anything about rugby have heard of. And I actually think how the scrum was implemented in the game was very nice, to a point. What I mean by that is, once a scrum begins, you can kind of move the pile around on the field a little bit, but it appears to be completely random who ends up in possession of the ball. And perhaps that's just one of the ways where it's hard to translate rugby into a video game, but not really having any control over this feels like something that could be improved upon somehow. If you're not familiar with rugby terms, the line out is basically the same thing as a throw-in in soccer, with the exception being that both teams line up to attempt to catch the ball, which is thrown in bounds parallel to the goal line. This is the play where if you've ever seen video of rugby highlights, you might have seen players getting lifted up on other players' shoulders to try to catch the ball at its highest point. However, like the scrum, it doesn't really seem to like you have any control over whether your team catches the ball or not. You just have to try to react wherever the ball ends up. I feel like there should have been a better method of trying to come up with the ball. I get that maybe lifting players up might have been a bit too much, but as is, it feels like it's a bit lacking. Ultimately, I really don't want to complain about the controls too much though, because even with as little as I know about the sport, the game feels like rugby, and that's probably the most important thing. When a lateral starts to kick up and you eventually get the ball out to the end with one player to beat, and then it's just down past them to get the try, all while the audience gets louder and louder as you approach the goal line, it's a fantastic feeling. And I could definitely see it as being the closest you could get to actually watching a rugby match without having to find out what channel it's on. Although, in regard to that, I guess there's one place in which the broadcast of the game falls apart, and that's how the pitch is shown on the screen. Clearly, Rugby World Cup 95 was influenced by the FIFA series, as the pitch is presented in the same isometric fashion as that series of games. However, the only problem with that is, just like in FIFA, since you can't see the entire field, sometimes it becomes very difficult to tell where you actually are, which causes problems like trying to determine if you need to kick the ball away, or perhaps if you're on a breakaway but can't see where the fullback is, and then all of a sudden they run on the screen at the last minute, and you're just annoyed because if you'd known where they were, you might have changed direction to try to avoid them. Part of this comes down to the somewhat nondescript way that the rugby pitch is marked, so it's more of an issue with the sport itself. And to be honest, it's really not that much of an issue at all, but just be prepared for those moments when you think you're in the clear, ready to down a try, and then bam, the other team has the ball and they're marching back up the field. Having said that though, in all other regards, I'm very impressed with the graphics. The animation used for all of the players is top-notch, and without doing a direct comparison, it seems even better than what was used in FIFA. This is amplified by the fact that rugby union teams consist of 15 players a side, rather than just 11 for soccer, so there's even more sprites for the Genesis to try to keep up with at once, and it always does an admirable job, with only the most minor flicker showing up when things get really crazy. I think the thing that I was most impressed with was the scrum animation.
It makes sense that scrums would be a priority with how synonymous they are with rugby, but even taking that into consideration, it's clear that they did a great job of trying to animate all aspects of the scrum, starting out with the initial lockup of both teams and then the actual movement on the field. For a 16-bit title, I'm not sure that they could have done a much better job given this specific engine, but I suppose maybe one ding is that it appears they traded animation and number of sprites on the screen for player numbers, so you never know exactly who you're playing as, which can potentially be a problem as forwards and backs have different player ratings. So if you don't know if you're controlling a forward or a back, it's going to be harder to determine if you should try certain things like kicks. From a sound perspective, I have no complaints. Nothing about the music to the game is particularly noteworthy. I mean, it's not bad, but you're also only going to hear it on the menu screens, so it doesn't really have to do a whole lot. What's more important in a game like this is the sound effects, and I'd say those are excellent, but they're also probably largely borrowed from other titles, namely FIFA. The various grunts and thuds are particularly satisfying, and it even seems like that you'll hear different ones as the players tire if you're playing in simulation mode, which is a nice bonus. Playing Rugby World Cup 95 and really getting properly introduced to the sport for the first time this last week was a lot of fun. I learned a lot, which is something that's always a goal of the channel, and hopefully by watching this review, you've learned some things too if you're like me and only had some vague notion of what rugby was. I only had two things that really stuck out to me as issues with the game. One that I think is something that needs some improvement, and one that's more of an annoyance. The main issue to me is that it's not incredibly deep, due to the lack of any kind of stat tracking or individual stats for the players, and having the teams be somewhat anonymous in that regard is a little disappointing, especially when compared to other games at the time, where even if they didn't necessarily get the players' names correct due to licensing restrictions, you could still differentiate between who was who. And while this isn't a huge deal, the thing that bothered me that you could chalk up to being just more of a little annoyance was the lack of battery backup, meaning that if you were competing in a league or World Cup, you'd be having to get the pen, even though the game was a Christmas '94 release. I guess they were trying to save money because they weren't expecting it to sell well, but still, if you have a league or a season mode, there needs to be battery backup. And chances are there probably wasn't more detailed stat tracking due to having to rely on passwords. Even with those issues, I think Rugby World Cup 95 was a great effort and a more than fun game, especially when you bring that chaos to multiplayer. And as a result, I'm giving Rugby World Cup 95 3 stars. If you see this one cheap, I highly recommend picking it up and messing with it for a bit, even if you're not a rugby fan.
And that's it for Rugby World Cup 95. I've got to say, reviewing this game was a bit intimidating at first, due to just my almost complete lack of knowledge of the source material. But I ended up having lots of fun, and came out of this week knowing stuff about the sport that I didn't know before, so maybe that'll come in handy someday at bar trivia, who knows. I mean, I'll probably still end up mistaking a ruck for a maul, but at least I have a chance of answering correctly. I'm hopeful that this good experience might translate to when I have to eventually review Brian Lara Cricket or Jimmy White's Whirlwind Snooker, but I'm trying to keep expectations low. Next time on the channel, I promise it is not a sports game. However, it's also a game that more than likely you've never heard of, as it's an unlicensed title that I'm only reviewing because Pico Interactive picked it up and released it back in 2017. It's not a new game though, as it was originally released back in 1993, just not in the United States or Europe. I'm a little stumped on a hint for this one, but maybe this guy could help you out. By the way, the Flying Elvises, very underrated wrestling team. I think they could have done a lot more with that gimmick. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 271. If you like what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you're so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.